no point of reference. And so the subtly shifting stars directly ahead of them took her by surprise. The shift was so small she almost missed it. The nav computer saw it too. "Coming to a full emergency stop," called Whitehorse. She worked furiously at her controls, trying to figure out what had caused them to stop. The nav computer claimed there was an obstruction, but nothing showed up on the main sensors. Lieutenant QWERTY at the shuttle's tiny comm console sat up a little straighter. "Ma'am, Admiral Tigray is calling?" She nodded for him to patch it through, and Tigray's voice boomed over the cramped compartment's speakers. "Shelby, do you see it?" She looked out the viewport again. Nothing but black emptiness and distant pinpoints of light. The stars that had seemed to be shifting earlier had disappeared. "No, Miguelito. What the hell is going on?" "It's right in front of you. Watch, they'll open the shuttle bay for you to land." And then, as if the darkness itself was peeling back, a section of the view ahead of them lit up with an almost piercing brightness. When her eyes adjusted, she recognized the interior of a small shuttle bay, just a few hundred meters ahead. "What the hell?" "IDF research has made some progress since you left command, Shelby. We've nearly perfected stealth, though as far as I know, there are only 2 ships in existence. Luckily, IDF research has a major laboratory and production facility here on San Martin, so I nabbed one for in-field testing. And now it's yours, until we figure this shit out." QWERTY tapped a few buttons and nodded. "Yeah, looks like the approach vectors and landing coordinates are coming in now. Just room enough for 6 of us in there." He glanced over at Proctor. "Small ship, Admiral." She murmured her reply, still transfixed on the blotch of light floating before them, the interior of a shuttle bay surrounded by stars. "Doesn't need to be big. Just needs to be fast and run silent. This could be just what we need to get to the bottom of everything, without a target on our backs." Ensign Babu deadpanned. "Fantastic. This will make my job a whole lot easier." "Fewer bullets to jump in front of for me?" asked Proctor. "Screw that, that's the Marines' job, ma'am. No, I mean it's a small ship. Easier to keep track of you and supplied with coffee. Do you have any idea how hard it is to keep up with you on a ship the size of the Independence?" Babu was talking absent-mindedly, still staring at the light from the open shuttle bay with blackness and stars surrounding it. "I'm sure this has all been very hard on you, Ensign. You have no idea, ma'am," he murmured, which made Proctor smile. In the few weeks he had served as her personal aide, she'd come to rely on his dry humor and sarcastic asides. And the coffee. The shuttle glided past the shuttle bay doors and settled into a cramped parking space off to the side as the 5 fighters behind them soared in one by one. "Miguel, what tech does this stealth rely on? Arena here tells me that multispectral light bending just isn't possible." "Not over an open channel, Shelby." His voice boomed over the comm. "I'll be joining you shortly, and we can talk aboard the Defiance before you head out. See you in a few." Chapter 37. Orbit over San Martin, ISS Defiance Conference Room. The conference room was small. Everything was small on the Defiance. The deck officer, whose name Proctor still did not know, had briefly shown her to her quarters, which were little more than a bed within a closet. Proctor and her small, trusted group of crew members had been sitting at the ship's conference room table for under 2 minutes when the door opened again and Admiral Tigray stepped through. His uniform sleeves a little too short and a few stains from the day's lunch dotting his pant leg, but wearing that broad smile she had grown to love over the years. "Shelby," he said, "so good to see you again. I wish the circumstances were better." "As do I," she replied, standing up to give him a hug. "We need to be brief," he said. "We don't have much time." "Time?" said Proctor. "What's going on?" She sat down uneasily. Tigray pulled a chair away from the wall and sat down. "It's IDF intel," he said, leaning an elbow onto the table. "They've been running regular sensor sweeps in the system outside the purview of CENTCOM San Martin." "That's odd," said Proctor. Isn't the local office of IDF Intel supposed to report directly to you? It should. Tigray ran a hand over his thin white hair. It's disturbing, to say the least. Lieutenant Whitehorse raised a finger. I'm sure IDF is on high alert in every system due to the recent Dulmasi incursion. Tigray nodded. Yes, it is. But I've never lost control over the day-to-day operations of Intel activities within my command area, he said. CENTCOM San Martin covers half a dozen star systems. It seems like Oppenheimer is consolidating operational authority across all military divisions. Proctor shrugged. We did that 30 years ago during the war, she said. It allowed us, or rather, allowed the top brass at the time to consolidate and coordinate intelligence-gathering activities with the war-fighting efforts. Yes, said Tigray. But the funny thing is, CENTCOM Bolivar has no such restrictions. Only CENTCOM San Martin, CENTCOM Britannia, CENTCOM Veracruz, and CENTCOM Indira have lost direct control over their local branch of IDF Intel. It's almost as if, Proctor finished his sentence for him, as if any central command, or any other IDF command center not affiliated with Shovik Orion, is being stripped of all operational authority. No? Tigray looked glum. Yes, that is my concern. Which means that the Central Command on Earth is not only tolerating Mullins but supporting him, endorsing him. They either subscribe to his views or they're being held hostage by Shovik Orion's lucrative defense contracts. Or rather, what would happen to our ships and combat systems if Shovik Orion decided to bail on UE all at once. Proctor shook her head slowly, rubbing her temples to resist the looming headache. I can't believe we're even talking about this in the middle of another alien invasion. It's the same bullshit political drama that played out last time this all happened, 30 years ago. Let's just hope that this time we can expose the traitors before the real enemy strikes too hard, too deep. Real enemy? Admiral Tigray, scratching at the sides of his mustache. The real enemy is always the one you trusted the most, the one that can hurt you the most. Let's face it, Shelby, if Mullins is working against us, if he's working against IDF and working against Earth, he is the real enemy, not the Dulmasi, not even the Swarm. The conference room, already quiet, turned morgue-level quiet at the mention of their old enemy. Proctor calmly folded her hands in front of her on the table. You don't suppose the Swarm is back, do you? Said Lieutenant Whitehorse. I mean, if admirals are acting strangely, issuing rogue orders you guys don't understand, what I mean to say is, if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, isn't that kind of how things were during the Second Swarm War? Everyone suspecting everyone else of treachery? Since the Swarm was able to infect people with their virus and control them, no one knew who was Swarm-corrupted and working for the enemy, and who was still themselves. Now the entire Russian High Command was corrupted at one point. Proctor wanted it not to be true, and so far the evidence had pointed elsewhere. The recent attack of the Golgothic ship, and now the new offensive by the Dulmasi, bore no relation to how things played out during the Second Swarm War. This was odd. This was different. This was something new. Yet it was still something able to make humanity fight each other. That was the hallmark of an effective, no, a brilliant enemy. One who could divide its foes, make them fight amongst themselves, and then move in for the kill when everyone is distracted, pointing fingers and guns at each other. I highly doubt this is the Swarm, said Admiral Tigray. But I'm hoping, Shelby, that with the Defiance you'll be able to get to the bottom of everything. Proctor wished that were the case. She wished the answer to their problems were as simple as taking command of the new ship. Granted, the Defiance's new technology was impressive, but technology was next to useless if you were lost in the fog of war, flailing at shadows and held at the mercy of unseen enemies. But during the inspection of the Defiance, and during the most recent battle, especially during the aborted kidnapping attempt, she had come to the conclusion that it was time to take the offensive position. The best kind of defense she knew. Okay, here's the plan. We're going to attempt communication with the Dolmasi. Every head in the conference room turned towards her. Every eye widened. Proctor held out a hand towards Lieutenant QWERTY and continued. Mr. QWERTY here is our secret weapon for this particular battle. If we could just communicate with the Dolmasi, and through them, unravel the conspiracy, that would empower us, enable us to get our own house in order so we can finally face the external threat undivided. You heard that moon in the Jakarta sector disappeared, right? Talrishi? Admiral Tigray, his expression already grave, looked almost scared. Or at least he'd look scared if Proctor didn't know any better. She knew Miguelito was made of solid tungsten, despite his tendency to wear his emotions on his sleeve. She nodded. Yes, I did. Just imagine, Shelby. The power to make a world disappear. An entire world. Or worse yet, the power to move it. What if whatever we are dealing with has the power to make that moon reappear right in the orbital path of New Jakarta itself? Or worse, what if they have the power to transport that moon light years away and put it in the path of Earth or Britannia? If our enemy has that power, we are pretty much screwed, said Lieutenant Zivik, who had been uncharacteristically quiet until then. The other 4 pilots were down in their ready room, presumably playing cards and bantering. She was sure he'd be there too if she hadn't requested his presence in the meeting. Words right out of my mouth, said Proctor. Ma'am, began Fiona Liu. There's also the issue of the possibility that Mullins has a stealth ship of his own. It all adds up. That metaspace signal at Mal Prime that came out of nowhere pointed straight at us. That was probably him, and he was almost certainly pulling the trigger on that botched kidnap op. That certainly is a possibility, said Tigray, nodding. And I can equip you with some specs, some data that might help you detect him when he is running silent, or if he is running silent. But I'm afraid that if you're flying one of these stealth ships and you don't want to be seen, no one is going to see you. The implications of that were terrifying, almost as terrifying as the aliens' alleged ability to move entire planets, or at least make them disappear. Proctor wondered if perhaps the 2 technologies were related. What if the disappearance of Bolivar's moon was not a coincidence, but rather the next stage in Admiral Mullins's schemes? But what his end game would be in such a scenario she couldn't fathom. Tigray was watching her. I know what you're thinking, Shelby, but at least there is some good news. The 2 technologies couldn't be more different. The stealth technology is actually quite basic at the fundamental level. Sure, we've got some special EM-absorbing coatings, radar-absorbing coatings, that kind of stuff. But the workhorse of the stealth system has more of a theatrical bent, if you catch my meaning. Proctor chewed on this information for several moments before Raina Scott broke her silence. Oh my God. You're just putting on a light show. A trick to fool their censors, aren't you? She said. Tigray held up his hands. You caught us. The game's up. Proctor couldn't suppress the look of horror that she knew was spreading over her face. She wasn't sure whether she should feel horrified or gleeful. On one hand, essentially relying on a magic trick to keep her safe was foolhardy indeed. On the other hand, it might help them detect Admiral Mullins when and if he decided to come after her himself. You can't be serious, she said. It's actually quite sophisticated software, he said with a grin, and Proctor swore she saw a wink in there too. The hull, in addition to being painted with the special EM-absorbing coating, has also essentially been converted into a computer monitor, or rather, a highly sophisticated holographic computer monitor. It automatically detects the location of the sensors and cameras that are attempting to track it, performs a little computational wizardry, and makes the hull look like the appropriate star field from the point of view of the observer. Mimics the spectral output of each individual star it's supposed to be impersonating. It's actually quite impressive. Commander Scott was nodding her head approvingly, looking back and forth as if performing the computations herself, and even looked both Proctor and Tigray in the eye, she was so excited. That's not just sophisticated. That's bloody brilliant. Not even multi-phase, multi-source, multispectral analysis could ferret out the signal if it were done properly, with a small enough time lag. Hell, even if you ran multiplexed inverse Fourier transform— There she goes again, said Ensign Babu. Reyna flashed him a mock glare. The two had actually taken to each other quite well in the short time Babu had been aboard the Independence. So, said Proctor, we are undetectable. We're running silent. We've got, as I see it, 3 missions. Number 1, figure out how to communicate with the Dulmasi and end their attacks. Number 2, gather intel from the Dulmasi and any other source we can to figure out who the hell is behind this conspiracy to kidnap me or to kill me. I'm not yet convinced it was Mullins. And even more importantly, figure out what their goal is, what their end game is. And number 3, the usual. She glanced around the table, meeting them all in the eye one by one. Save civilization, again. Ensign Babu raised an eyebrow. I used to watch an old show when I was a teenager, and it reminds me of you, Admiral. Oh? Yeah, every week the heroine beat some new danger. Monsters, vampires, demons. And when she died, on her tombstone they inscribed, "She saved the world. A lot." He allowed that to sink in for a moment before he dryly held up a finger, then raised an eyebrow and added, "For the record, I don't think you're going to die on this mission, Admiral." Proctor was speechless, and after a moment she decided that it was quite funny and laughed, which gave tacit permission for everyone else to laugh. And in reality it was a little funny. Granger was sure he was going to die on any number of occasions when he saved civilization back in the day, and seemed to pull through every single time. Except for that final time. And his tombstone would forever be the event horizon of a black hole. Unless... Shelby, they're coming. Damn it, Tim. What were you trying to tell me? Chapter 38. Orbit over Bolivar. ISS Vanguard. It took his Secret Service chief far longer than he would have liked to coordinate with security on the ISS Vanguard, Mullins' ship. But after another hour, President Quimby finally took the short shuttle ride over and met Mullins in the shuttle bay. So exactly how long have we had stealth, and why the hell wasn't I told about it? Quimby extended a hand to the Admiral who met him in the bay, alone. He interpreted that move as the other man trying to send the signal that he considered himself such an alpha dog that he didn't even need sycophants and aides hanging on his every word and ready to answer his beck and call. Either that or he didn't want anyone listening in. Just a few months, actually. I've only had the Vanguard since August, and to my knowledge, she's only one of 2 prototypes. Still working out some kinks before Shovik Orion's Bolivaran shipyard goes into full production. His grip was firm, not too tight, and lingering just long enough to let Quimby know that he wasn't afraid of him. Good. He could work with that. There were other motivations than fear, and the President was a man who would use whatever tool he needed to get his way. And by the end, he'd make the Admiral fear him all the same. Assuming Shovik Orion still has funding in the next budget, Quimby said. Believe me, my friend, you don't have a bigger ally than myself in the budget process coming up with Congress, and I've got a fair amount of political capital to spend. But, as you know, politics is nasty business. Some days I'd rather be making actual sausage than the shit-fest we have to do in New York. Mullins' eyes narrowed at the mention of money. Good. That was his one weakness. Even as he made a big show of throwing his weight around and letting his balls hang out, his real nutsack was in the wallet. And if Quimby threatened to kick it, even subliminally, Mullins would bend. I'm surprised that Congress would even hesitate funding our contracts, given how central we are to nearly every military system. And given the fact that we're currently in a 3-front war. The Admiral smiled. But let's save the budget negotiations for another day, as riveting as they are. Even though my detractors tell you otherwise,
My loyalties lie first with IDF, and the survival and prosperity of United Earth. Come, Mr. President, we have much to discuss."
Quimby's Secret Service detail went ahead of them, led by Agent Carter, greeting their IDF counterparts on the ship and coordinating the details of the president's stay with Calvin Quinkert and McBird. Quimby followed Mullins into the lift, then onto the bridge itself for a brief inspection tour, before they finally settled into the captain's ready room. Quimby dove right in. "So, talk to me. I just can't believe that Oppenheimer could be controlled by the swarm. He's the leader of IDF. How could their influence have escaped our notice all this time? And how can you be so sure that they are not, in fact, all dead, just like the top brass swears they are? We haven't seen hide nor hair of them in 30 years. Mullins brought over 2 cups of coffee, both black, without cream or sugar, as if he expected them both to take it the same way, strong and unsoftened. And he was right. Black coffee was like blunt talk, in-your-face refreshing.
"I assume you want it strong?"
Quimby nodded. Another little detail he filed away. His adversary was perceptive, even in his dick-wagging. He wondered how much of it was bluster and show, meant to distract from what his true intentions were, and how much was true character. Probably all show. True character was rare. "Thank you." Mullins sat down across from him.
"Of course Oppenheimer would claim the swarm is dead. The worst enemy is the one you don't think exists, and yet here we are in the midst of an invasion by an unknown alien race, the so-called Golgothics. They've only sent one ship, but when's the next one showing up? And what are they doing to Ido? What did they do to Elamine? Where did Talrishi go? What are they doing to Titan and half a dozen other moons across our space that are somehow, against all the laws of physics, growing in mass? Believe me, Mr. President, this is just the tip of the invasion, and if we don't have firm, solid, unwavering leadership, we could fail."
Was that a veiled threat? Well, of course it was, but like the most skilled of diplomats, he'd couched it in terms of doubting Oppenheimer's leadership, not Quimby's, keeping the doubt of Quimby's leadership implicit. Quimby replied in kind. "I've seen no indication he's under any kind of alien influence." He thought it prudent not to mention that Oppenheimer suspected Proctor of being under swarm control, which would have implied that Oppenheimer didn't, in fact, believe the swarm was truly gone, as Mullins claimed he believed. But Quimby was willing to follow Mullins down this rabbit hole just to see where it would lead. Mullins chuckled.
"Nor would you. When the swarm was controlling half the Russian High Command back during the Second Swarm War, no one knew, except for Russian Confederation President Malikov himself, who managed to set things up such that he alone was left untouched by the swarm. They're good. Very good. You simply can't tell someone is under swarm influence just by talking to them."
"So what's your proof, Admiral? You do realize that over half the members of my senior military staff don't trust you, ever since your hair-brained assumption of power on Bolivar and acceptance of the executive chair at Shovik Orion in direct violation of half a dozen conflict of interest laws and regulations. No one trusts you. In fact, they're all scared shitless by you. Scared you'll pull the plug on all our military systems if they speak out too firmly against your brazen conflicts of interest." The Admiral waved his hand as if batting aside a pesky fly.
"My proof is simple reason. Logic. Look at the pieces of the puzzle. Start at the beginning. Granger flies into the black hole with a shitload of President Avery's antimatter bombs, supposedly closing the swarm's link to our universe. Now stop right there. Stop right there. Good Lord, have you thought about how idiotic that assumption is? From our perspective, he finally crossed the event horizon only a few weeks ago. And yet, somehow, the antimatter closed the metaspace link 30 years ago. Clearly, there's a breakdown in logic there. We wanted to win that war so badly that we believed what we wanted to believe. After 10 billion dead, we were desperate to think that the war was over and that we'd won.
Quimby had to admit the man was right. The explanation of the swarm's defeat, the public explanation at least, never sat well with him. It was too easy, too convenient. So you're suggesting that Granger didn't, in fact, close the swarm's link to our universe?
I'm suggesting that maybe it was in the swarm's best interest to let us believe we'd closed it, so that we'd let our guard down. Think about it, Mr. President. In the closing days of the war, we were actually doing quite well. The Dolmasi and the Sciora were both on our side. President Avery had retooled society such that we were churning out starships by the hundreds and conscripts by the millions. We were the sleeping dragon. And once the swarm woke us up, there was no stopping us. Swarm technology and viral influence be damned. It was in their best interest to let us think we'd won. In the meantime, they'd regroup and then come at us, smarter.
What, by leaving sleeper agents among us? Then coming at us with a new ship design that pokes holes in random moons? Mullins smirked.
Random?
He waved a hand towards the view screen on the wall, which picked up on his movements and automatically displayed a predetermined chart and map.
Take a look.
Quimby examined the star chart and accompanying lists of data, but couldn't decipher it. Help me out here. What the hell is this? Mullins stood and pointed at certain spots on the map.
Earth, Britannia, Bolivar, San Martin, Mao Prime, and New Jakarta. 6 of the largest worlds of United Earth, and each of them has, or in San Martin's case had, a moon somewhere in their solar systems or in a solar system within 5 light-years that was attacked by that alien ship.
So you think the swarm is targeting moons near our major population centers? To destroy them and rain debris down on us? Alameen exploded, sure, but have you heard that Talarashi just flat-out disappeared? Mullins nodded.
Yes, and the rest of the moon's masses are slowly increasing.
So what does it mean?
It means what I'm telling you. The swarm is here. They never left. And in the 30 years they've been hiding, they've been developing new technology to end us once and for all. Think about it. Talrishi disappeared. Exactly where do you think it's going to reappear? What if it reappears just a few thousand kilometers from Earth and slams into it? Would be quite the fireworks show. Same goes for Britannia, Bolivar, all of them.
Quimby stood and began to pace. So what you're telling me is that you think the swarm essentially faked their own deaths, laid low for 30 years developing moon-flinging technology, maintained a few sleeper agents among our top ranks, so that when they decide to fling some moons at us, we'll be busy fighting amongst ourselves because of all the chaos caused by the sleepers? Mullins shrugged.
More or less. It's so simple it's actually quite brilliant. And Oppenheimer is very busy keeping us looking the other way with this pet Dolmasi war of his and his strange insistence on seeking out the Kuyasi and Findiri.
I still can't believe he's just trying to start a war to distract us from a swarm invasion.
You don't have to believe it. You can see it. Come with me aboard the Vanguard to San Martin, and you can eavesdrop on a conversation I'll have with Miguel Tigre. Just to see. See if his conclusions are the same as mine, and see what he says to me when he doesn't know you're listening. Determine if he's in bed with Oppenheimer. Christian says he wants to find the Kuyasi and the Findiri. Why? To truly end all known, unknown threats against us, as the saying goes? Or is it something else? Watch Tigre's reaction when I tell him the latest news that I found out just moments ago before we walked in here.
Quimby stopped pacing the ready room. And what is that?
Ido just disappeared, too.
Chapter 39. The dreams always came when events felt out of her control. And even within the dream, Proctor marveled that she was able to recognize something like that rationally, even as the dream proceeded against her will. "You're going to be in so much trouble, Shell," said Carla. She didn't even bother wearing the wig anymore. She flaunted her shiny scalp like a trophy. Generals and fleet admirals decorated their chests with bars and insignia. Cancer survivors wore their scars like well-earned medals. Except it was premature to use the word survivor. "You just worry about keeping lookout and let me worry about the mission." The mission. That's what they called their pranks. It gave the hijinks a sense of gravitas that otherwise would be absent by just calling them what they were: stupid, childish pranks. In this case, using a miniature plasma welder Shelby had borrowed from the school's shop to fuse the lock on the door on the principal's office. The plasma torch was acting finicky, refusing to ignite. "Shell, come on, hurry! The secretary will be back any second," Carla whispered furiously from the doorway that faced the sitting area outside the principal's office where his assistant usually worked. "It's fine. She'll be occupied for another 5 minutes at least with those donuts. That was brilliant, by the way, Car, giving her your Scan Day donuts." Scan Day donuts. It had become a monthly ritual. Every time Carla was due for a neutrino-enhanced magnetic scan to check the progress of treatment, their father would take a quick shuttle up to New York City to buy a dozen of the best donuts in the world from a little shop on 9th, and they were always still warm by the time she was finished with the scan. But this time, they were secretary bait. "Screw that! I miss my Scan Day donuts already," Carla said, still peering around the corner. Shelby took a deep breath, thumbed a few of her rosary beads under her shirt, and lifted the torch up to the lock, whispering a silent prayer. "This will totally be worth it. Best mission yet. Just imagine Principal Calderon's face tomorrow on morning announcement when he says—" She dropped her voice to a mock version of the man's. "The culprits will be found and dealt with swiftly and—" A deep throat-clearing interrupted her. "Fairly? Or were you going to say mercifully? Because I assure you mercy is the last thing on my mind this time." Principal Calderon, arms crossed, stood over Shelby, who was still kneeling down with her arms raised, miniature plasma welder in hand. Shelby glanced back at Carla in the doorway, who had frozen like a deer in the headlights. "Amicably? Congenially?" "Miss Proctor, I thought the last time I had you in my office we agreed that the next juvenile prank would be your last. You agreed to be on your best behavior. You swore it would never happen again. That you would start acting like an adult." Shelby racked her brain for a pithy response. Even in the dream, adult Proctor came up with a half-dozen good ones, but teenage Proctor never got the chance. Before she could even open her mouth, the secretary had appeared, her face urgent, her hand waving a phone. "Josh, it's Dr. Proctor. He says these two need to get to the hospital right away." Principal Calderon looked like a kid who had had his candy sack taken away from him on Halloween. Shelby could almost hear the swears under his breath. He turned to her. "Miss Proctor, the time will come when you can't use your sister's illness as an excuse for bad behavior." Shelby stood up, making a show of dusting off her knees. "I'm so terribly sorry, Mr. Calderon. Carla interrupted her. "I think what my sister is going to say is that we're going to milk this cockamamie tumor for all it's worth, sir. Lord knows we've earned it." Shelby wanted to kiss her. She didn't even look back to see the look on the principal's face as she left the office, her arm around her sister's shoulder, the other hand rubbing her scalp for continued good luck. "Sis, you never cease to amaze me." Carla scowled. "Hey, we got off that time, but the next time we won't be so lucky." "The next mission, you mean? And I love that you automatically assume there will be a next mission, because you're right, there will be. And this time I've got the perfect Calderon mission. It'll involve a diving board, the local media, and possibly a goat. Come on, let's get to the hospital and hear the good news. It's probably just the doc with the results of your scan. Chapter 40. Orbit over San Martin. ISS Defiance. Bridge. We're already down here, Admiral. It was oddly comforting to hear Reyna's old voice coming out of the comm on this new ship. These engines are a real beaut, purring like warm kittens. I think I just might adopt them, smother them with motherly love, buy them awkward presents, embarrass them in front of their girlfriend. We've got a real mom vibe going on here. Thank you, Reyna, said Proctor. Lieutenant Civic, are your pilots ready? Civic's voice answered through the speakers. Yes, ma'am. Ace and Bucket's injuries are still smarting, but they keep insisting, and I quote, it's only a flesh wound. Another voice interrupted him. I said I'm fine. That must be Ace, thought Proctor. Admiral, is Lieutenant QWERTY up there? Yes, she said, puzzled. I talked with him earlier about a way we, the pilots, can maintain contact with the Defiance while she's stealthed. I think I've got a solution. Can you spare him later? I'd like to discuss it with him. Proctor nodded. By all means, Lieutenant Broadside, after we've made the Q jump and determined the lay of the land once we've arrived. She turned her head to the comm station where Lieutenant QWERTY was finalizing his preparations. Everything ready on your end? Yes, ma'am, he replied in his drawn-out drawl. Except for this damn shoelace that broke. I swear, if Shovik Orion's boot suppliers were half as good as their tactical— I meant, is the stealth system ready, Mr. QWERTY? Oh, right. I've tapped into the stealth programming, and I can manipulate the apparent spectral pattern of one specific star that appears on our hull from the Independence's point of view, and encode messages in the spectrum so we can stay in contact with Captain Balls. Excellent work, she said. Let's test it out. Send a message to old Ballsy that we're ready to head out. Engage the stealth and see if they can make out the message. Also, ma'am, I've already discussed the use of the emergency long-wave radios with Ace. I didn't think we'd need to go over it again. Maybe those pain meds are messing with her noggin, if you know what I mean. Proctor frowned. He had a point. This mission required a high state of readiness. Of course, didn't all their missions? She made a note to talk to Civic about it later. I'll keep that in mind. Now, engage stealth. QWERTY tapped a few buttons. Proctor wasn't sure what to expect when the stealth device engaged. She supposed there would be no discernible change from their point of view, so she was surprised when the view screen blanked out. Where before they had a full view of the blue planet of San Martin below them and the starfield beyond. What happened? The screen stayed blank. Oh, for the love. Don't tell me we're blind with this thing on. The view screen cameras don't have anything to pick up, no ma'am. But we still have passive sensor capabilities. Passive sensors. I suppose active scanning sensors would be a dead giveaway for our location. I'd assume so, ma'am, QWERTY said with a tip of an imaginary hat. But passives are still pretty thorough. We're not blind down in the microwaves, radio, and of course neutron, gamma, and neutrino detectors. Proctor grit her teeth. This would be quite an experience, to say the least. Begin message to Captain Balls. You read me, Ballsy? If you do, tell me what you really think of this mission. She glanced over at Lieutenant QWERTY again. After a moment of studying his console, he nodded. There it is, ma'am. There she blows. Detecting a passive phase modulation in their magnetic engine containment envelope. Running it through my handy-dandy translator. He nodded approvingly at his console. They call my son batshit Shelby, but he's got nothing on you. Stay safe, and we'll be looking over your shoulder, assuming we can see where your shoulder is. He looked up. And a message. Proctor smiled. Loud and clear, Ballsy. All right, people, let's get this show on the road.
Set a course to Sangre de Cristo. I think it's time we had another chat with Secretary General Curiel. Maybe we can untangle his relationship with Admiral Mullins and start to get to the bottom of this."
Lieutenant QWERTY nodded.
"Message sent, ma'am."
He continued nodding.
"Ready when you are, Shelby."
A nervous expression passed over his face, and he looked up suddenly.
That was Captain Valls, ma'am."
"Yes, thank you, Lieutenant. I assumed so."
She turned to the navigation station, which was only 3 feet in front of her and to the left. The bridge was almost as tight and cramped as her quarters.
"Miss Liu, have you familiarized yourself with the controls?"
She had asked the former IDF intel officer to take the helm, since space was cramped and they needed everyone on the bridge to actually serve a purpose. And recent events had shown her she could trust the young woman with her life.
"Yes, Admiral. I had basic navigation training as part of my intelligence operative training at the Academy, and these controls are as straightforward as they come."
Proctor nodded.
"All right. Set a T-jump course to Sangre de Cristo. Let's go get some answers."
Usually, she would be able to tell when the jump had occurred by the shifting star field on the view screen, but as the view screen was blank, she had to rely on the telltale shift in her inner ear's sense of equilibrium. The very brief moment of vertigo passed quickly, and Liu announced,
"Arrived at Sangre de Cristo, Admiral. High orbit. Thank you, Miss Liu."
"Stealth is holding steady, Admiral,"
said QWERTY.
"Thank you,"
said Proctor, standing up out of her chair and peering at the empty screen.
"I'm afraid I'm not going to get used to this. I hate flying blind."
"Hang on, ma'am. Let me see if I can work some magic,"
said QWERTY. He tapped a few buttons, shaking his head, mumbling to himself. After about a minute of silence across the tiny bridge, he looked up, a look of triumph on his face.
"Here we go. Let's see if this don't work."
The view screen shifted to reveal what Proctor would have called an infrared view of the planet and the fixed star field behind it. It wavered and flickered slightly, almost as if heat currents were passing in front of it, but at least now she could see what was going on, or rather confirm with her own eyes that they were indeed orbiting Sangre de Cristo. She could just make out the ruined habitation dome that was destroyed by the nuclear weapon. The nuke inadvertently delivered by her own nephew. The same nuke that someone had killed her Danny for.
"Focus, Shelby."
Proctor shook her head in delighted amazement.
"Mr. QWERTY, you have outdone yourself this time. You're a polyglot, and now you apparently can do rapid signal analysis at the drop of a hat. If they don't give you a pay raise, I'm sending a sternly worded letter to your supervisor."
"Oh, shucks, ma'am. Writing a letter to yourself would be awfully kind."
He tipped his invisible hat again.
"Honestly, signal analysis isn't all that much different than figuring out a language. I mean, sure, it's nouns and verbs and morphology and all that malarkey versus carrier waves and Fourier analysis, but there are actually a lot of similarities. All you have to do is look for the patterns."
Proctor's inner voice repeated the phrase, "Just look for the patterns." But what if there was no pattern? What if it was 1 in a million? Fiona Liu swiveled her chair to look at him, interrupting Proctor's thoughts.
"Why do they call you QWERTY anyway?"
"Well, ma'am, seeing how it's my name and all makes sense, don't it?"
Liu raised a single eyebrow.
"Really? Your last name is QWERTY, as in QWERTY?"
QWERTY grinned.
"Yes, ma'am,"
he drawled, but hesitated.
"Or rather, it is now. Funny story behind that. You see, I applied to the Academy on a dare, and—"
Proctor cleared her throat.
"Mr. QWERTY, I am confident this is a good story, but it can wait. Civilizations to save, remember. Right now, we need to find Curiel, and while I'm interrogating him, I need you to decipher an entire alien language. Possibly 2, if the info that Krull gave us about the ligature is off in any way. Please run a passive comm scan on all bands, both civilian and military, and see if we can't track him down. Last I heard, Sangre was his center of operations.
Yes, ma'am, said QWERTY. He swiveled his chair back around and began scanning, looking up at Lieutenant Whitehorse, who nodded, and the two, as if by prior agreement, began to split the work between them.
How is the Independence doing? She said.
Her old ship had just T-jumped in moments ago. It struck her how she already thought of the sleek cruiser as her old ship, even though she'd only been on it for 2 weeks.
Let's send Captain Valls a message that says—
QWERTY hesitated. Admiral? I don't exactly have the comms crew with me. Just a mom-and-pop operation we have going on here. He shot a wink over at Lieutenant Whitehorse. No offense, ma'am. I didn't mean to marry us off so fast. He was right, of course. Proctor was used to barking out orders and having a bridge full of officers at her beck and call to carry out her instructions. This would take some getting used to. Ensign Babu cleared his throat from the corner of the bridge.
If you need an extra bridge hand, ma'am, I do have 2 of them. Ensign Babu, pardon me. You are entirely correct. Please, if you would, go get me a cup of fresh coffee.
Babu actually looked crestfallen. Maybe he couldn't take it as well as he dished it out. He ducked out of the door to the bridge and returned a few minutes later with the steaming cup.
Thank you, Ensign, she said.
He perked up at that, and she made a mental note that he'd probably benefit from an actual mission sometime, just to give the man a break from his coffee duty. But nothing too dangerous. Good assistants were hard to come by. And after her last assistant, the late Ensign Flay, she brushed the line of thought aside. Lieutenant QWERTY looked up from his console with a look of mild surprise. Ma'am, speak of the devil. The Independence is receiving a hail from a compound in Maria de Luján, one of the dome cities. It's Curiel, asking for you. Chapter 41. High Orbit Over Earth. Freighter Angry Betty. The cargo bay on the Angry Betty was a cramped, awkward space. For all the advances over the years in spaceship design and even in things like materials science and manufacturing processes, nothing could ever replace the need for duct tape, and Chris Keene saw that it had been put to liberal good use in the bay. Hole in the plasma cargo pallet jack? Duct tape. Light panel coming loose from the ceiling? Duct tape. Smuggling compartment doors not closing properly? Duct tape. Graviton emitters coming unscrewed from the Q-jump drive? Duct tape. But in the center of the bay, resting on an array of wooden pallets, was the massive steel shipping container full of gallium. He imagined it sloshing around as the orbital thrusters maneuvered them into a very particular inclination around the planet below. Though, now that he thought about it, he wasn't sure if it was still all liquid. He'd kept the cargo bay at a chilly 10 degrees C, well below the point the liquid gallium would solidify into a massive, solid chunk of metal. Now that it was frozen, the whole steel shipping container, combined with the solid chunk of gallium within it, basically formed a metal block the size of a small house. Weirdest shipment ever. But the customer had specified that the temperature in the cargo bay be 10 degrees, so 10 degrees was what he set it at, no questions asked. All he had to do was repeat his mantra. $3 million, $3 million, $3 million, country estate, women, parties, cars, hell yeah. He went through the checklist the customer had given him. All the miniature orbital thrusters were retracted into the cargo container, as well as the dispersal nozzle and pump equipment. He checked that the gallium was, in fact, solidified. A multi-tool analysis sensor confirmed it had solidified to the core. Check, check, check. When the final item was checked off his list, he got ready to send the signal to the recipient. The customer had assured him another ship would take the cargo off his hands once he'd arrived and gone through his delivery checklist. Time for payday, bitches. He thumbed the comm switch on his datapad and keyed in the channel the customer had given him to signal the other ship. At least he assumed there was another ship he'd deliver the gallium to. Static. Nothing happened. He keyed it in the comm channel again. Nothing. Nothing, that is, until his ship exploded, but Chris Keene wasn't around to appreciate the expanding cloud of glowing slag, the remains of the Angry Betty, a fiery maelstrom surrounding the still intact, now red-hot steel shipping container full of gallium. And as the cloud cooled several minutes later, the thrusters poked out of their pockets in the steel walls, ignited, and pushed the battered, glowing hot container along a very particular orbit high over planet Earth. Chapter 42. Orbit over Sangre de Cristo, ISS Defiance, Bridge.
Lieutenant, send a message to Captain Valls. Tell him to take the call for me. Have him tell Curiel I'm washing my hair or some shit.
QWERTY nodded and typed, "Or some shit. Got it."
And then patch us into the conversation.
This should be good. Moments later, the link was live. The view screen, which had shown the wavering infrared image of San Martin, was replaced by a split screen of Valls and Secretary General Curiel, as telegenic and youthful as the last time she saw him a few weeks ago, when they were both being shot at by unknown assailants.
"Captain Valls,"
began Curiel.
"I had hoped to talk to Admiral Proctor. When will she be available?" "She's indisposed at the moment, Mr. Secretary General, but I speak for her. How can I help you?"
Even though he was obviously well trained for work in front of a camera with a face to match, he struggled to contain his displeasure.
"Well, first off, please relay my appreciation for her assistance over Earth a few weeks ago. I regret that we didn't have the time in the immediate aftermath of, the incident to have a proper conversation."
Valls smiled.
"Oh, you mean the incident where a GPC sympathizer destroyed our shuttle bay, killed half a dozen flight deck staff members, and then launched a stolen nuclear weapon out the back door, nearly incinerating Northern Europe. That incident?"
Proctor chuckled to herself.
"Palsy, you're good."
Curiel almost blanched.
"Yes, that incident. Our investigation is still ongoing as to how that bomb was stolen and how it was smuggled aboard your ship. Please relay my assurances to the Admiral that I'll get to the bottom of it. Eventually." "Eventually."
Valls leaned in towards the camera.
"I'd hope that you get to the bottom of it faster than eventually. Losing a nuclear weapon is kind of a big deal, Curiel."
The Secretary General's face clouded over with annoyance.
"Just tell Admiral Proctor that we're working on it, but we've got bigger fish to fry. The bigger threat right now is the Dalmasi. My people in the Veracruz sector are telling me that they're detecting massive fleet movements. They're not going to stop at Mare Prime. And you can't just count on the Skua to bail you out like last time."
Proctor snapped her head back to Whitehorse.
"How did he know about that? That's classified."
Through the comm, Valls seemed to read her mind.
"I see the GPC's intelligence service is second to none."
Curiel waved a hand.
"Please. Everyone in the system could see what happened, even if we weren't privy to the conversation that took place between the Matriarch and Proctor. The Skua show up in their big-ass ship, and all of a sudden the Dalmasi pull up and leave. Of course the Skua made them stand down."
Valls shrugged.
"And the reason I'm calling, besides to warn you about the fleet movements, I need to pass a message to her."
A smirk crossed Valls's lips.
"A message. Who in the world is using the Secretary General of the GPC as a messenger boy?"
"Oh, ballsy. You sure know how to press people's buttons,"
murmured Proctor as she saw the anger flash on Curiel's face.
"I only agreed to it because of the importance, because of how the events are tied to each other."
He took a breath as if trying to suppress his anger.
"Patriarch Huntsman asked me to request a meeting with Admiral Proctor, as he believes he has something she wants, or rather knows someone that has what she wants."
Valls stroked his beard stubble.
"Very well, I'll let her know. What, does Huntsman want to set up a meeting with Proctor and Huntsman? Isn't that something our secretaries could have done?
Or are you taking on secretarial duties in addition to being a messenger boy? Huh. Well, I guess you are the Secretary General. Proctor couldn't help laughing out loud. Curiel's face grew redder. Before he could explode, Vols held up his hands. Sorry, Mr. Secretary General, it's been a rough few days. Repelling the Dulmasi attack, we sustained casualties. You'll forgive us for being a bit, lacking in patience at the moment? Now, what does this information actually mean, and who's this oh-so-secret source of Huntsman's? Huntsman is on Britannia right now, and he's with his source who apparently is very eager to pass on the critical information to the Admiral, but didn't think it prudent to go through the usual channels as she is under constant watch. You see, the source has very particular knowledge about the Dulmasi and doesn't feel comfortable sharing it with the powers that be. There's too much at stake. The source? Vols leaned even further in. Not over an open channel. Vols turned to his side to say something to the officer filling in at comm. Moments later, he turned back to the camera. We've encrypted. As long as your side is secure, we're fine. He leaned in farther, his lined face filling the entire half of the screen. Source. Curiel hesitated but relented. Former President Barbara Avery. He's with her now and asks that Proctor get there immediately before. Well, let's just say I'm sure there are people who don't want the information she has getting out. You know what I mean. I understand you've had recent, difficulties on board your ship. People you've trusted that perhaps you shouldn't have. Proctor gripped her armrests. Curiel knew about the mutiny, the kidnapping attempt on Proctor. That either meant he was behind it, unlikely, or that his intelligence people had contacts on board the ship, or contacts within the organization that was behind the attack, whether IDF Intel or Mullins or someone. But more importantly, she finally had a lead, from a source she never would have expected. From 99-year-old former United Earth President Barbara Avery. Chapter 43. At the hospital in downtown Boston, their father met them in the reception area of the oncology clinic. His face was grave. Girls, sit down. Carla, you feeling okay? Her face flashed with nervousness. Yeah. Why? They both sat down. Their father sat next to them. His eyes were squinting a little, his brow furrowed. Oh no. Dad never could hide his emotions. The news was bad. Real bad. I'm afraid I have good news and bad news, he said, opening the envelope in his hands. The results from the scan. Shelby wanted to cover her ears. Even though adult Proctor Dreaming knew what he was going to say, she wanted to run away. Escape the injustice of it all. Yeah? Carla's voice had started quivering. The bad news is, you're in big trouble. Principal Calderon told me everything. Girls, this behavior is inexcusable. The bad news? Principal Calderon was the bad news? Shelby felt her face bloom into a wide smile. And the good news is, the scan came back completely clean. Not a single malignant cell left. It's actually quite miraculous. You're cured, honey. It took a moment for the news to sink in, and when it did, Carla exploded with squeals and shrieks and laughter. Shelby joined her. She'd been imagining this day for 6 long, grueling months. It was like a godsend. The doctors had said that just like the tumor being 1 in a million, the cure would be just as elusive. This type of cancer was breathtakingly aggressive and resistant to treatment. And so, at her mother's urging, Shelby had prayed, and prayed, and prayed. And great jumping Jehoshaphat, it worked. It actually worked. There was a God, and he liked children and puppies and scan day donuts. Speaking of which, but her father was 1 step ahead of them. Do you know what I think we should do to celebrate? We should have some scan day donuts. Carla's face was pained, embarrassed.
Dad, I kind of used those as secretary bait, sorry.
He grinned. I know that. No, I'm saying we should skip the rest of school today, all fly down to New York, and get the donuts in person, hot out of the fryer. It'll be fun. You deserve it, sweetie, after everything. Carla squealed again. It was the best day ever, and Shelby pulled her rosary out and kissed it.
I believe, she thought. Damn it, Mom, you were right. And I believe.
Chapter 44. Orbit over Sangre de Cristo. ISS Defiance, Bridge. They had orbited Sangre de Cristo for almost 24 hours, giving Admiral Proctor some much-needed time to recuperate from the wound in her arm, and giving the Independence time to continue repairing the damage sustained during the engagement with the Dulmasi at Mal Prime, and giving them all some time to figure out what to do next. Avery had summoned Proctor, through the GPC's Secretary General Curiel no less, but she didn't have time for meetings with people in retirement homes. With open war between United Earth and the Dulmasi, and Titan, along with several other moons in the UE, continuing to swell with mysterious added mass, her time to make on social calls with former presidents was down to 0. Proctor rubbed her forehead. A headache had settled in, and the recent revelations were only contributing to the pain.
What the hell is former President Avery doing in the middle of this? She's retired.
Fiona Liu, scrunched behind the tiny navigation station, swiveled back to face her.
Actually, during my stint at IDF Intel, I heard that she keeps her fingers in a few pots. No actual power, but enough people owe her favors that she's managed to at least stay in the game as a spectator. The game?
Liu shrugged.
You know, the game. That's what we called it in the service. The behind-the-scenes maneuverings, the backstabbing, the blackmail, the extortion, the backroom deals, the above-board diplomacy and the secret threats. The fog of war, all of it. And from everything I've heard, Avery lived for it back in her day, and she could never quite give it up once she left office.
Proctor nodded.
She did love it. She had so many secret programs going on that I don't think the top brass ever uncovered half of it. In fact, it was her secret antimatter bomb project that ended up winning us the Second Swarm War, in a way that not even she foresaw. If those warheads hadn't been on the Victory when Granger piloted it into the penumbran black hole. Makes sense, in a twisted way.
Proctor raised an eyebrow.
How so? In complicated situations like that, like in the Second Swarm War, there was no way to know exactly what was going to work or through which path victory would be achieved. And so Avery, at least this is my theory, basically had a scattershot approach. Her goal was to throw as much shit against the wall as she could and wait to see what stuck.
Sometimes it seemed that way. The fog of war could be so thick at times that Proctor often wondered if it might not be a wiser course of action just to strike out in random directions to keep her many enemies off guard and unbalanced. Throw as much shit against the wall and see what stuck. Eventually, one of the 1 in a million chances would stick, and they could all go home and take a long vacation.
Life doesn't work that way, Shelby. No, we don't have time for that.
She turned to QWERTY.
Send word to Captain Vols. I want to go confront Mullins, make him see some reason. See if he's behind this attempt to get us into a war with the Dulmasi, she added with a knowing glance at Liu. Oppenheimer doesn't seem to have the balls to do it, so I guess someone has to.
QWERTY nodded, but before he could acknowledge, Lieutenant Whitehorse caught her attention.
Ma'am, I'm getting odd sensor returns from the debris field of Elamine.
She leaned forward.
Odd? How so? Nothing terribly urgent, it's just that, well, I'm doing a passive optical scan of the debris field, which is getting wider by the second, but the size distribution is off, and it doesn't match the scan from when we first showed up in the system.
Proctor stood up and approached the tactical station.
Show me.
Whitehorse brought up a graph of the size distributions of the debris field and overlaid it on the one taken several hours previously. Sure enough, there was an odd bump on the new graph that was not there on the old.
There. See it? I can't explain it. A bump centered on 112.5 square meters. What's the uncertainty? Does the data have error bars? Could this just be an artifact of, I don't know, our angular position with respect to the debris field and Sangre de Cristo, or something like that? Uncertainty is less than 0.1% on any given data point. This is 10 times that. Could be a fluke.
Proctor rubbed her forehead again.
Or it could be something else. 112 square meters cross-section. Tell me, Ms. Whitehorse, do you think it's coincidental that the bump in the data just happens to occur at the same size as your average light cruiser?
Fiona Liu cocked her head.
Are you thinking there could be a fleet hiding out there? Curiel? As far as I know, he doesn't have more than a few ships loyal to the GPC. Perhaps Mullins has something else up his sleeve.
Lieutenant QWERTY glanced up.
Or, ma'am, could be Dolmasi.
The look on his face told Proctor that he wasn't guessing.
Metaspace activity?
Yes, ma'am.
She walked over and gripped the edge of the comm station.
Mr. QWERTY, are you ready? You've had 2 days to learn their language and the ligatures protocol from Krull's notes. Was that enough?
He grunted, then grunted some more, then coughed violently before screeching something vulgar-sounding.
Excuse me, ma'am. That was Dolmasi for you can bet your cheesy grits I'm ready.
Proctor raised another eyebrow.
You suppose the Dolmasi have cheesy grits?
Be a shame if they didn't, ma'am.
It was enough, in spite of the urgency and dread of the situation, to make her chuckle, to take the edge off.
All right. Set Q-jump coordinates. Take us out there, Ms. Liu. And please inform Ballsy where we're going. I imagine we'll need some backup.
Chapter 45. Wreckage of Moon Elamine, ISS Defiance, Bridge.
Fighters on standby, just in case.
The orders went out, and Proctor imagined Vols was doing the same thing on the bridge of the Independence. As much as she liked the silent, invisible, and incredibly deadly Defiance, she missed her ship.
Ready, Admiral,
said Liu.
Initiate.
The screen shifted, and the wavering infrared image of Sangre de Cristo was replaced by a cloud of rock and dust and glowing debris as the remnants of Elamine collapsed back in on itself, initiating new explosive collisions that ejected massive bands of material out into space. And right there on the screen, sidled up to an assortment of giant rocks, hung a Dolmasi fleet.
Gotcha,
she murmured.
Reading 18 Dolmasi cruisers with an assortment of fighter craft, all mostly powered down to avoid detection.
Whitehorse looked up.
Looks like they were hiding here, probably massing their forces for an attack on Sangre or San Martin. And now?
Whitehorse examined the sensor readout.
Looks like they're powering up. Weapons? Not yet.
Whitehorse shook her head.
I think maybe that the fact they can only see the Independence might suggest to them that we're not looking for a fight.
Proctor stroked her chin.
Send word to Captain Vols. Have him tell Admiral Tigre back at San Martin what's going on and to send backup.
QWERTY got to work on the message, and when he was done, he looked inquisitively at Proctor.
What is it, Lieutenant?
I think we should open a channel to the Dolmasi, ma'am.
Why? When we open our channel to talk to them, they'll see there's 2 ships. Might spook them, and they could just start shooting.
QWERTY shrugged.
Don't see any way around it, ma'am. If we want to test out my Dolmasi chops, I gotta shoot the shit with an actual Dolmasi.
He pointed at the screen.
And that there is an actual Dolmasi fleet. The more I talk to them, the more I'll understand them.
She grit her teeth. There wasn't time. Tigre hadn't shown up with the San Martin defense fleet yet, and yet QWERTY was right. The best way through this emergency would be through simple communication, talking to their enemy, understanding them rather than fighting them. Open a channel. Chapter 46. Wreckage of Moon Elamine, ISS Defiance, Bridge. On the view screen, Proctor watched as the 18 cruisers slowly turned to face the Independence. Even in infrared, she could see the running lights powering on all up and down the sides, and before long the group split into a formation of 9 ships each. "That's a Dulmasi attack formation," said Proctor. She spun towards the comm station. "Mr. QWERTY, it's now or never." He gulped, nodded, and took a deep breath before tapping his channel open.
Stock Valek Kirsak Skirsak Kazvakas.
He continued on, making a series of seemingly random hisses and grunts. The formation of 9 ships on the left swung wide around a large asteroid and momentarily disappeared before coming around the other side.
"Admiral, they're powering up weapons,"
yelled Whitehorse.
"Huh. Well, they didn't like that one bit," said QWERTY. "Might have come on too strong there."
Proctor grimaced as the formation on the right followed suit and swung several dozen kilometers out before circling around to flank the Independence.
"Too strong. Let's make our best effort to not start another war here, Mr. QWERTY."
"Yes'm. From what I can tell from Dulmasi culture and its effect on their language, you need to start a conversation from a position of bullheadedness and strength. Almost overblown, otherwise they'll think we're too weak to even bother responding. You can tell from their emphasis on morphological structure that their language has been heavily influenced by—"
"Mr. QWERTY, as a former university professor, I appreciate the lecture, but for now, please focus on helping us to not die."
Loud and clear, ma'am."
He cleared his throat again.
"Skerasakus Ankalefalakus Kirasak."
Whitehorse shook her head.
"Ma'am, it's not working. Their targeting systems are coming online. An attack on the Independence is imminent."
Proctor stood up.
"All right, that's enough. Reyna, how close can we get to one of their ships before they can detect the stealth effect on our hull?" "Right on top of them, basically. Just got to stay far enough away so their cameras can't resolve the refresh rate on the projectors. Basically stay a diffraction limit length away, 50 meters? Okay, Miss Lou." She turned to navigation. "Half thrust and take us right on top of the lead ship there on the right." "Ma'am, at that range, if they fire at us, we're goners. We're not going to let them do it."
A deadly silence fell over the tiny bridge as they watched the lead Dulmasi ship grow larger and larger on the screen. Before long, it was so close that Proctor knew if she went and looked out a port, she could essentially reach out and touch it. And they knew that one blast from the Dulmasi antimatter beam would be enough to end them all.
"Holding at 50 meters, Admiral. Matching their course and speed." "Good. Now, target the other formation. Fire a few low-velocity gun rounds, enough to hurt them, but not bad."
Everyone turned toward her.
"Ma'am?"
said Whitehorse.
"But also enough so that the other formation knows they've been fired upon from this direction. Look, Independence is over there at 3 o'clock. It'll confuse the hell out of them."
Whitehorse shrugged, but did as ordered.
"Direct hits onto cruiser at point. Now, Lou, get us the hell out."
Lou scowled in confusion, but directed the Defiance to arc above the plane of the engagement.
"Clear of the enemy formation, Admiral. Holding at Z+5 clicks."
She turned towards Proctor.
"Might I ask what that was all about?"
Proctor watched the screen intensely.
"If my suspicions are correct."
She trailed off, gazing at the 2 formations still angling towards the Independence, which itself had started to turn to bring its main guns to bear.
That the Dolmasi are here is not a random occurrence. She turned to face her small crew. 3 things. First, Oppenheimer has been getting after me for weeks to use the metaspace pulse technology against the Dolmasi. He claimed it would disrupt the ligature, which it clearly does. That much was obvious at Malprime. And that disruption aligned with his long-stated goal of finding and neutralizing the latent Quiasi and Findiri threat. Second, I suspect it also summons them, a giant sign that says, "Here I am, come get me." It's why the Dolmasi showed up at Earth after that nuke exploded with the metaspace shunt attached, and the Golgothic ship for that matter. She paused, long enough for Lou to lean in expectantly. And the third, Admiral? I believe the metaspace pulse also disrupts their higher reasoning functions. Like language, reasoning exaggerates their natural tendency toward violence, incites anger and uninhibited fighting. What they do next could not only confirm that hypothesis, but also point to why they're here in the first place, and also confirm the motive behind Oppenheimer's insistence upon using this stupid weapon. And, as if the Dolmasi were waiting for the cue from Proctor, the formation that had been fired upon unleashed a barrage upon the ships nearest the Defiance, raining a shower of green beam pulses with destructive force against the hulls which shattered and broke and exploded outward into space. The nearby formation returned fire, and soon, the independence forgotten, the 2 groups pounded each other with bloodthirsty ferocity. And that motive? Said Whitehorse, though her face suggested she knew the answer as she watched the scene unfold. Dolmasi on Dolmasi violence and utter destruction. To start an interstellar war, and to assure that we come out on top, Proctor finally sat back down with a sigh, by making all our enemies go insane. Chapter 47. Wreckage of Moon Elamine, ISS Defiance, Bridge. Admiral, 2 of the Dolmasi ships are disabled and a 3rd is losing power. Whitehorse looked up. What are your orders? Proctor was still deep in thought. That the Dolmasi were this affected, this unstable, meant that someone nearby had recently deployed a powerful metaspace pulse. Hell, that the Dolmasi were even here at all suggested as much. Nothing. We do nothing. We can't afford to do otherwise, as appalling as this is to watch. QWERTY motioned towards her. Ma'am, getting a message from Captain Valls. Read it. QWERTY jumped right in. Shelby, are you sending out metaspace messages? I wonder if that's not affecting the Dolmasi somehow, like how we talked before. I'd suggest shutting it down, whatever it is. Proctor glanced at QWERTY questioningly. Wasn't me, ma'am. He double-checked his console status board. But it could very well be an echo from the pulse that clearly lured the Dolmasi here and wigged them all out something fierce. If they get strong enough, metaspace echoes can last for hours. Mr. QWERTY, you're up. Do something. Pull out all the stops. If you can't put an end to this, no one can. QWERTY swallowed hard. I'll try, ma'am, but nothing I was saying earlier seemed to be making an impression. I was confrontational, vulgar, blasting, everything I could think of that they would respond to. Well, try something else. Proctor watched as the infrared screen lit up with antimatter beams as the Dolmasi ships pounded into each other. QWERTY was shaking his head and muttering strings of Dolmasi words into his receiver. Wait, she said. You're talking to them through the ligature, right? On the view screen, a nearby Dolmasi ship exploded. Yes, ma'am. The ligature is a Sciora invention, and it was imposed upon the Dolmasi by the swarm. Maybe we need to talk like one of them, less confrontational, more. Her mind raced. How did the swarm always talk, at least through the beings they controlled? Manipulative, confident, almost smarmy and overly familiar. Friend.
They continually called beings they targeted for incorporation into their family friend.
Be kinder, Quetty. More agreeable. The swarm was never insulting to us, even as they annihilated billions.
Roger that, he said, and leaned back into his receiver. A different string of sounds came out of his mouth and throat, less guttural, softer, more agreeable. Lieutenant Whitehorse watched the screen and whistled.
Well, I'll be damned.
Proctor turned to watch it too. The antimatter beams ceased. She couldn't be sure, but it almost looked like each Dulmasi ship actually turned to look at the Defiance.
We're still stealth, Lieutenant?
Whitehorse slowly nodded and triple-checked her instruments.
Yes, ma'am.
The silence was almost eerie. The Dulmasi ships, some of them half destroyed, simply hung there in space, pointed toward the Defiance as if they could see it. Ma'am, they're hailing us.
Us?
She spun around to Whitehorse.
Is that stealth working or not, Lieutenant?
Whitehorse furiously worked her console, checking and rechecking, but QWERTY answered for her. Sorry, ma'am, they're not so much hailing us as hailing you. On a broad channel? I don't think they know exactly where we are, otherwise they'd use a tighter beam.
Me?
Yes, ma'am, they clearly want to talk to, the consort of the Invincible of Earth. His face took on a pained expression. Sorry, ma'am, I think by consort they mean companion.
So it's English now?
Broken English, but yes. Proctor gripped her armrest, almost unsure of what to do. But this was clearly the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, been working for.
Can you reroute our response through the Independence? Make it look like we're transmitting from there?
QWERTY nodded. I think so. Tight beam to Independence through laser, and then they broadcast through regular comms.
Do it.
Half a minute later, the view screen shifted.
Well, I'll be damned,
Proctor muttered under her breath. The screen was filled by the image of a Dulmasi. After all these years, she'd almost forgotten what they looked like. Vaguely reptilian, skin scaly with a somewhat greenish hue, eyes like fire and a stare like flint. And this one looked familiar. Chapter 48. Wreckage of Moon El Amin, ISS Vanguard, Bridge. Admiral Mullins turned towards President Quimby, who was staring at the screen with his mouth half open.
See, Mr. President.
Is that a Dulmasi? Mullins nodded. Quimby couldn't seem to peel his eyes away from the screen. Ugly sons of bitches, aren't they? Next to the alien's image, another appeared. Her. Admiral Shelby Proctor.
Just as I suspected, Mr. President.
He gave a surreptitious nod to his tactical officer.
Shall I give the order?
Quimby waved him off. Hold on, Ted. Let's see where she's going with this. Mullins drummed his fingers on his armrest impatiently. Very well. If the bastard needed more proof before the order was given, all the better. More plausible deniability for himself. Chapter 49. Wreckage of Moon El Amin, ISS Defiance, Bridge.
It's Karsa. Vishgane Karsa,
said Proctor almost under her breath. QWERTY's eyes narrowed. Ma'am?
The same one Tim and I talked to 30 years ago, during the Second Swarm War.
She watched the alien's face, looking for signs of familiarity, any sign that the alien also recognized her. But in place of recognition, Karsa looked agitated. His eyes flitted back and forth, his hands squeezed and clenched the air restlessly. Well, regardless, ma'am, you're live. He can hear you. She cleared her throat and slowly stood up.
Vishkane Karsa, is it really you?
He hissed.
I'm Proctor. Do you remember me?
More hissing. The alien looked like he was only barely holding it together.
We fought together, side by side, 30 years ago, you and I. We beat them. We destroyed our enemies. The enemy that kept your people as slaves for thousands of years. And now, it's good to see you, friend.
The hissing turned to something a little more mellow. Karsa opened his mouth and tried to speak.
Consort. Vishtak Shostaka. Stastaj. Why? Why? We'll destroy you, Kirsak. We'll destroy you if... Kirsak. If we must. If we need, we'll destroy. Back. Kirsak.
Proctor held her hands up and outward, a universal sign of peace, submission.
I swear to you, we are not your enemy. We do not want to fight you. Our enemy is...
She trailed off. It occurred to her that she still had no idea who their enemy was. The truth was the enemy was... themselves. Mullins? Curiel? Whatever was changing Titan and destroyed Elamine?
Our enemy is... not you. We want only peace, only friendship.
Kirsak. Same with Valarisi. Swarm. They want... make friend. Make us friends. Slaves. Kirsak. Kirsak.
She turned to QWERTY questioningly. She mouthed the word Karsa kept repeating. Kirsak. In as low a voice as possible, QWERTY replied, I think it's an insult. Like a cross between dog, son of a bitch, and, I think, slave. Slave. It made sense. The swarm made the Dulmasi their slaves for thousands of years, made them their enforcers, their mindless, will-less warriors.
We destroyed them, Vishkane. You and I made them less than Kirsak.
His eyes flared wide, pupils like embers.
There is no worse than Kirsak.
The meaning was clear. Karsa considered death better than slavery.
I agree, Vishkane. But they're gone, and we are not your enemy.
He seemed to consider this. After a moment, he spoke.
No. No enemy.
We are friends, allies. Let us fight together. Join our forces against that which assails you.
Karsa's eyes defocused and flitted somewhat, like he was trying to remember something he'd forgotten, something he knew long ago and was struggling to remember. And then he seemed to find it. He nodded. Proctor remembered, 30 years ago, Karsa had been particularly diligent in learning human mannerisms. The nod was significant.
Our enemy is human. You know that, consort.
She really wished he'd stop calling her that. To the Grangerites, she was the companion of the hero of Earth. To the Skjora, she was mother killer, and now consort? Good grief. But his enemy was human? He stared at her. He seemed so sure of it. And maybe he had a point. Perhaps